This one cleared out for Romeo Lavia!
The Belgian Didi, or a lost soul with too many holes in his game to be of elite substance. Just how good is Romeo Lavia?
Showed that for Rangers. Is Walker Peters.
Lavia's long passing is truly mind-blowing. It's a weapon, and you don't find me saying that often. It can unlock defences. He's probably the closest to Pirlo out of the next-gen midfielders that I've reviewed. What makes him so effective? He has an appreciation of the tactical layout of the opposition, his own teammates, and he's able to calculate so quickly, knowing who's going to be marked, who isn't looking, who is ready to receive, and such is his technical proficiency, very Didi-like in this respect. He can hit long passes even after an awkward bounce with an unfamiliar part of his foot, and he makes it look effortless. At times he can be overambitious, trying to switch play even with his weaker foot and getting it wildly wrong. But I think he could master that given time, and how many players could you name that tried to play long with either foot? Probably Xabi Alonso is all I can think of. His favourite pass is that faded over the top for a right winger to run into. Is it perfect? Not yet, but it's getting there, and I can see that being a game-breaking pass for years to come.
Showed that for Rangers. Is Walker Peters. Turn 19. And here he goes again.
Statistically, Lavia's dribbling doesn't seem to be pulling any trees, which is difficult to fathom because on the eye test he looks a phenomenal ball carrier. Does he overrun it much and try too much? Perhaps, but that is probably reflected by the fact that his successful dribbles percentage is quite low. But I see a player with unbelievable balance, sharpness of turn, and in the middle of the park that can be priceless, especially at the highest level, where space is at a premium. He loves to use pure body feints, he's quite stocky, protects the ball well, and he accelerates quickly, so overall his ball carrying game should go from strength to strength as he matures. He's not a particularly flary dribbler who uses 5-star skills, and for that reason I don't think he's as dazzling a ball carrier as a Didi. But in fairness, he doesn't need it to be effective. He shifts at such incredible angles at sharp speed, and the skills will probably only slow him down.
Wolves with 7. This now is Lavia.
Lavia's goal threat numbers are incredibly poor, and the eye test supports this notion. Whilst Lavia is pretty good at picking up spaces around the box, he shanks his shots pretty wildly. He lacks the disguise as to when he's going to pull the trigger, which leads to a lot of his shots getting blocked. And what's particularly concerning is that even in youth football, Lavia didn't really score any goals. So if he did want to be an 8, the sheer lack of goal threat means that that's not really a viable option unless he really develops the regista element of his game. So if he's controlling games in the manner of a Thiago and a Verratti, then the paucity of goals is forgivable.
League, Southampton, since Sayas has taken.
Lavia's pass volume is quite low, which is understandable. He's playing for Southampton, he's not really playing for a dominant elite side. Based on the pure eye test though, he doesn't really seem to be the type who will perpetually string and connect passes, suffocating the opposition. So I can see this perhaps getting to an average of perhaps 40 to 70 passes per game in his prime, rather than the 90 odd you see from the likes of Verratti and Xavi, pure game controllers. What is impressive, however, is his pass accuracy, very press resistant, generally finds ways of getting out of traffic, and he's got that IQ and the base technical game to really feature for a dominant possession side, but probably not as the primary playmaker at this moment in time.
Ashley was sent off by today's referee, David Coote, when he made his Chelsea debut.
In terms of creativity, despite what the stats say, Lavia has a great feel for a line-breaking pass from deep midfield. He may not be the type of player you want in the final third playing the final pass, but in terms of finding his centre forward or playing it in between the centre back and the full back, he's got a good weight of pass and a strong sense of timing as to when those runs are going to be made and when to release those players. What makes him particularly enthralling as a prospect in this regard is his willingness to use his weaker foot for through balls, and he does a damn good job. So imagine a midfielder who can split defences with either foot. That's an unbelievable weapon to have, especially deeper in midfield. So he reminds me a little bit of prime Seedorf in this regard. I can definitely see him therefore generating a fair amount of assists and particularly mastering the pre-assist as his career progresses. Lavia's crossing is quite frankly terrible. Statistically, eye test wise, it's a very underdeveloped attribute, and that's an issue because the half space is such an important area in the modern game, and if an advanced 8 couldn't get into that wider space and cross the ball, that's a huge source of chance creation lost. So I wouldn't really recommend using him as a Mezzala type of midfielder in a trio, and I'd prefer to utilise him in a more central, deeper role. Can he improve this part of his game? I'd hope so, because his long passing is pretty damn good, and he can clearly whip a ball when playing a longer pass. But there's a whole lot of work to be done here tactically, technically, to elevate this part of his game. Lavia is not a player who participates in a great amount of aerial duels at this moment in time. His success rate is quite high, but based on the eye test, he still looks pretty undercooked. He doesn't give me that Gavi-esque air of someone who's going to put his head where it hurts, no matter what. And that's concerning if he's going to be a CDM. I don't really see him as CDM material as the most defensive-minded player in the midfield, because he's more of a lover, not a fighter, and that comes across in the eye test, especially with his heading. And that's not what you need in a destructive, defensive, safety-first midfielder in front of the back four.
From Semedo and Alcaraz.
Lavia gets through a fair amount of defensive work, and he's got an engine, but in truth he's a mixed bag when it comes to his overall defensive game. Whilst he was a CDM in youth football and he's often the deepest midfielder for Southampton, would I trust him to be a sole CDM at the highest level? No, and he's not ready at the moment especially. He misses slide tackles too often, which leaves his defence exposed to runs from midfield, but at the same time when he is pressing he can be tenacious, he can win the ball back often, he's pretty good at cutting off passing angles. So as long as he's next to someone more disciplined positionally and he's allowed to be a bit more of a free roamer in his defensive work, I think that would be less of an issue. I just wouldn't want him to be the sole CDM. But then again, Tchouameni is someone we had doubts about in that regard, and he's definitely blossomed tactically and discipline-wise under Ancelotti, so perhaps couldn't write off Lavia this early.
To remind you of the game that you did not want to do something like that.
Lavia's challenge.
Tactically, Lavia has pretty much played in a double pivot all season with Ward-Prowse alongside him, whether it's a 4-4-2 or a 4-2-3-1. This is just a selection that we chose from the most recent game. What I'd like to do is explore his game by showcasing what he could add to various sides. We start off with Liverpool. Now, this is probably the side in which his long passing would come to the fore the most. I can imagine him playing in the likes of Trent Alexander-Arnold or Robertson or even Nunes and Salah in behind. Chelsea, quite similar with their wing-back system. The long ball could also be a big factor, but I don't really see him and Enzo being compatible due to both of them not really being solid defensively, and I think they'd get in each other's way in terms of the long passing element. Just staying on the topic of Liverpool, he could be brought in as a deep line playmaker instead to replace Fabinho, and if they were to bring in the likes of Bellingham or a Kudus, both as box-to-box midfielders ahead of him, I think that could potentially work and give him that defensive security. If he was to go to United, what he would bring is an ability to break through enemy lines and give that team the press resistance which that midfield sorely lacks. Fred can be nimble, but he lacks the pass accuracy or the consistency in the killer pass, and Eriksen can't really carry the ball. So Lavia, in my opinion, would be a surefire upgrade in that respect. At Arsenal, if he was to replace someone like Xhaka, he could provide more support to Partey in the build-up, and he'd give more greater pitch coverage than Xhaka. But would he be as effective in the final third? And would he be able to provide that overlap ahead of Zinchenko? No. So that would mean probably Odegaard would have to go onto the left to keep that left-footed overlap situation going at Arsenal. So perhaps that team's not the most optimal fit. In conclusion, Lavia at the moment has a lot of gaping holes in his game. He doesn't really offer much of a goal threat, can't really operate in wide half spaces effectively, and defensively his game is too raw to be trusted as a pure defensive midfielder. And it's reminiscent of a young Pogba or a Seedorf, where the player is so athletically gifted, so technically mouldable, but they lack a distinct specialism in terms of positions that they can play, and there's too many gaps in their game for them to be a spinal player for a big side straight away. Often these type of players end up becoming support players, but very, very good support players who are still integral to an overall unit. Lavia may, however, have it within him to become a deep-lying playmaker just in front of the defence, but again, it's going to require tactical precision to ensure that his weaknesses are disguised and his strengths elevated. So yes, a prodigious talent, but one who needs time and patience to be allowed to blossom, and hard work by the coaches to polish his game. In terms of ceiling, looks generational. In terms of base level, looks like a player who should be a Champions League midfielder at the very minimum for years to come. I'd be surprised if he ends up less than world class, because there's a number of big clubs with excellent coaches at the helm who are in transition, and in theory that should have given the time and the patience to allow him to grow, and therefore the chances of him jumping too fast too soon into the deep end are minimal unless he's advised badly and really joins the club at the wrong moment. Is he going to surpass Didi? No, Didi had more skill in his locker, was much more technically refined and just controlled games better. Instead, I see Lavia as maybe imitating a Wijnaldum potentially tactically, but with elements of Pirlo in terms of how he spreads the play. So definitely a real interesting player. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Please do check out our Patreon, where you can find videos on players such as Liao, and we're going to be releasing a video on Osimhen soon. And like, share and subscribe. See you guys again next time. Bye.
Spare for Guardiola, joy for Mourinho.